Nature in Britain is a mess. A quarter of all of our native species of mammals are threatened with extinction. Species have declined by 19% since the 1970s. And more than half of our flowering plants, mosses and liverworts have decreased from areas where they used to thrive. Many say that our solution to this problem is rewilding, which means allowing nature to return through both natural and human-assisted processes. And I might be inclined to agree. Yet returning nature to Britain is steeped in a mire of exclusivity, controversy and hypocrisy so deep you might as well keep it buried under 10 kilometres of urban sprawl. Well, today it's time to unearth the wilderness. You may have seen this clip circulating on the news recently.
Joining me now is the President of the Republic of Botswana, His Excellency Mokgweetsi Masisi. Mr. President, hello and welcome to DW News Africa. So, just to be clear, you're not really sending 20,000 elephants to Germany, are you?
I might well be. If the Germans are able to come and collect them, I'm more than happy to facilitate.
The President of Botswana wants to send 20,000 elephants to Germany. But why? Well, Europe has a problem. In fact, we've had a problem for quite some time. You see, since the beginning of the emergence of traditional conservation, we in Europe and the UK have been telling other countries how to conserve their wildlife and nature. It's of no secret that the conservation world reeks of colonialism. Many suggest that the start of conservation as we know it today was John Evelyn's doing in 1664, who was a rich English landowner who published a paper called Sylva, which advised that forests which were being cut down for timber should be replenished so as to avoid the depletion of this natural resource. But why should conservation start with him? After all, what really is conservation? A commonly used definition of conservation is the preservation and protection of natural resources. In fact, the Cambridge Dictionary says that conservation is the protection of plants and animals and natural areas, especially from the damaging effects of human activity. Well, haven't indigenous people been doing this for millennia? But attributing the start of conservation to a well-off English landowner rather than to the indigenous people who have been doing the same thing for thousands of years is just the start of a long rabbit hole of questionable decisions made in the field of nature conservation. In the 20th century, for example, the British restricted hunting in Africa to preserve game populations for their own elite hunting trips, and then further displaced African people across colonized countries when they enforced the formation of national parks. And this is still unfortunately happening today, where indigenous people are being persecuted for hunting on or even entering national parks, which they have otherwise been living on sustainably for generations. Even large charities such as the WWF have been embroiled in scandal after scandal of human rights abuses.
Ngane brime legalities. Monde e anda bakoto koto joapele matoto no puma mbeli legalities masidi chauffeur ambeli boke masidi a racler nous le bim maté etebe to côté nous monter bidé ma obligé de monter konole.
And the forceful displacement of indigenous people and their ways of life, all in the name of conservation. So it's of no wonder now that the President of Botswana is angry at us Europeans for telling him to protect his elephants and wildlife from afar when we really have no idea of the actual impact this has on the environment and people. Because in Europe, and especially here in the UK, we've always had this attitude. We want the world to protect nature and wildlife, but we don't want this to be us. Recently though, with the advancement of the rewilding movement, this is finally beginning to change. Sure, nature conservation organisations such as the Wildlife Trusts or the RSPB have been around since the late 19th or early 20th centuries. But it's not been until more recently that actively restoring and bringing back natural processes to the UK has gained traction. Finally, after years and years of telling other countries to suck it up and learn to coexist with their lions and elephants, we're finally starting to consider bringing back some of our own larger wildlife, such as lynx or wolves or bison. And finally, after years and years of telling other countries to protect their own forests from deforestation, while simultaneously having spent centuries cutting down our own forests, we're actually seeing a small uptick of woodlands again, according to the Woodland Trust. Yet still, these changes in attitudes are few and far in between. We've been mulling over whether to reintroduce the lynx to Scotland since 2008. And are still not really any closer to actually doing so, apart apart from being more informed about what would happen if we did. So what is the real problem here? Is it simply our disconnect from wildlife and nature, making us tremble at the idea of sharing space with a medium-sized predator like a lynx, whilst we're telling other countries to suck it up and share space with lions? Well, apart from our serious apathy at taking nature restoration in this country seriously and making it a problem for other countries to worry about, I think there is a lot more going on beneath the surface. In fact, I don't think that the strange case of rewilding in Britain is simply just due to the public's fear of predators or concern about wilderness. No, the rewilding movement in Britain is mixed into a cocktail of our strange relationship with food, a whole host of class issues, and of course a particularly virulent strain of the capitalist mindset. We have a really strange relationship with food in this country. We're seeing increasing amounts of fast food being consumed, rising cases of obesity, and though there is plenty of good food to be had in the UK, almost none of it is actually historically British. The best cuisine you can find here comes from other countries, whether they were colonised or not. We are a melting pot of culture and food, yet most of the dishes we consume, apart from maybe the occasional pie of fish and chips, though apparently even that originated in Portugal, is not actually British. So it strikes me as strange that, although most of our food comes from other cultures and countries all over the world, we are so hung up over the idea of producing as much food as we can here in Britain. Sure, local and seasonal food is obviously better for our health, the environment and the planet, but I don't think that our penchant for British food production that is so ingrained in our culture has much to do with any of that. No, I believe that our desperation to produce as much food as physically possible comes from our idea that we must be fully and wholly self-reliant. The mentality of needing to produce all of our food at whatever costs seems to have originated in World War II, when the British were called on by the government to massively increase food production so that we didn't have to rely so much on imports, much of which were actually lost during the war. As a result of this, caloric output by British agriculture increased by 10 billion compared to pre-war levels. The main problem here though is that we haven't dropped this mentality, even though it's been over 75 years since the war ended. In fact, now we still produce crazy amounts of food, but this food just doesn't get to people. We waste around 9.5 million tonnes of food each year, and yet in 2022 alone, 4.7 million people in Britain were in food poverty. So something's not quite right here. I could make a whole video about the food system. I could make several videos actually. There are many more in-depth videos across YouTube that will go into specific niches about this topic. So for now, I just want to focus on one thing: our relationship between food and rewilding. Because when it comes to our relationship between food and rewilding, we come to a very strange situation. See, the mainstream attitude of a lot of British, including our government, farmers and just the general public, is that we want to be producing as much food as possible because of this attitude that's been ingrained within us since World War II. But a lot of this production is inefficient. Take sheep grazing on the uplands, for example, which massively reduces biodiversity and just doesn't produce much of any economic return for the farmers. So with many people wanting to leave our countryside to fields and fields of intensive agriculture, and having been used to looking at these same fields their whole lives, a green and barren pleasant land, it's of no surprise that when rewilders come along and want to reconvert these fields to rewilded spaces or restore natural processes on them, a lot of people balk at the thought. So a lot of rewilders are now trying to meet farmers in the middle on this issue, but advocating for regenerative agriculture, where meat can still be produced and nature restored at the same time. In fact, one of the most pioneering projects of rewilding in the UK uses this very model, where free-roaming wilder species of cows and pigs roam around an area, restoring natural processes through natural behaviours, such as snuffling through mud. Yet the price of meat produced this way is simply unaffordable to the vast majority of British people. Regenerative agriculture is such a fantastic method of producing food whilst restoring nature. And if you can splash the cash, regenerative eco-beef is like no other slice of steak. You can just feel it regenerating your body from the inside. I thought animal agriculture wasn't actually that good for the planet, whichever way we did it. Aha, that's where you're wrong. Regenerative farming tremendously improves biodiversity. But isn't that just because we're restoring the large grazing species which used to be present across the British Isles? Anything that isn't just our status quo of plonking some domestic cows onto barren monoculture, ryegrass fields is obviously going to see an improvement of biodiversity. Couldn't we just do that anyway without farming them? We must control large herbivore populations. If we don't cull them, they'll grow out of control. Culling them without tucking into their juicy rumps would be such a waste. Couldn't we just reintroduce predators who could do the culling for us? Obviously, this can't be done everywhere, but the more we allow nature to flourish, the more space there'll be to reintroduce predators, and the more biodiversity will be restored. In addition, animal agriculture has the highest greenhouse gas emissions, the highest land usage, the highest water usage. Even regenerative farming can't compete with plants. My question is, why aren't we doing the same but with plants? Why can't we combine rewilding and farming together but using plants? Plants just aren't as impressive. Plant farming produces monocultures with zero biodiversity. You might be saving some carbon, but you've lost nature. Polycultures exist, permaculture exists, food forests exist. All of these bring back biodiversity and let nature return, whilst producing nutritious, low-carbon, local, low-water and land usage food. And though many community groups, community-supported agriculture schemes, and market gardens are talking about this, in terms of the big rewilding names or spaces, zero, not a mention. Cows are just more exciting than plants. They stomp around and regenerate biodiversity, and they're tastier, and they have more protein, and people want to eat a feel-good steak, not a feel-good broccoli. Landowners can generate more money through regenerative meat and ecotourism than through permaculture and food forests. But if 4.7 million people are still in food poverty and so much food is still wasted a year, how are you going to address this with cow regenerative rewilding? Food is a systemic issue. It's a mindset issue. If people knew how good the regenerative cow was for the planet, they'd splash out a little extra to buy it. It's about sacrifices. But for most people, they're lost causes. They don't care about rewilding in nature. They're too nature blind. Let's just leave them out of it then. Rewilding is for people with lots of land, lots of wealth and grandiose ideas. The kind of avant-garde and revolutionary people that can secure venture capital funding and large grants and develop biodiversity credit schemes. Who cares about the people? We need to get nature back right now. Here we go. The main issue, the big one. Rewilding is just not for the working class. Where to begin? More than 6 million people in the UK don't have access to a green space. Half of England is owned by just 1% of the population. In fact, one report found that environmental subsidies, carbon markets and rewilding are key drivers of growing land concentration in Scotland, pricing out locals from being able to buy in their area. And in England, we aren't allowed to roam over 92% of our countryside. 92%. This, of course, disproportionately affects people of black, Asian and ethnic minorities who are 11 times less likely to have access to a green space than white people. And in urban areas, even urban rewilding is further driving inequalities. For example, in England and Wales, housing within 100 metres of a public green space are £2,500 more expensive than houses outside of 500 metres. But there must be some way that the public, especially those who are marginalised, working class, or just simply not rich landowners, can take back control over nature and rewilding in this country. Well, as it turns out, there are. But most of them are illegal. Guerrilla gardening, the growing of native plants or food on land that isn't yours without express permission to do so. If it's owned by anyone, even a council, banned. Accessing more than 8% of the land we're allowed to in England, that's trespass. Banned. Wild camping in England, except on Dartmoor, and even that was very recently almost banned. Banned. Beaver bombing or taking species conservation or reintroductions into our own hands. Banned. Restoring or growing foods on abandoned sites that are still privately owned. Banned. You get the picture. There's not much the average person can do to take direct control over the tanking of biodiversity in Britain. Unless you manage to get into university, then spend months or years volunteering for nature conservation organisations, then get a low-paying job, then grind your whole life until one day, you're lucky enough to get a semi-managerial position which allows you to make a few decisions. Slowly, some nature restoration organisations are starting to hire people who've gone a different route, such as through apprenticeships. But even so, nature shouldn't just be for people who dedicate their entire careers to it. Nature is a part of everyone, and everyone is a part of nature. Everyone should be able to have control and agency over the state of nature, just as they should have control and agency over every other part of their lives. Unfortunately, our system just simply isn't built this way. Nature restoration is blockaded by our government and its countless complicated licenses and legalities, by those who own most of the land in the UK and what they want to do with it. For the average working person in England, well, you could go to one of the few national parks or green spaces if you're lucky enough to live near one. Perhaps you're lucky enough that your children go to a school where they teach about nature. Or perhaps you're lucky enough that your children have just entered a school where they're going to teach the new natural history GCSE. Perhaps you're lucky enough to have some free time and choose to spend it volunteering for a local conservation group or organisation, brush cutting or planting or surveying. But if you're not rich or you don't own a garden or some land, then that's it. Nature is something for weekends, something to enjoy once in a while if you can, between the slim cracks of your everyday day-to-day life. And even then, nature and its restoration, especially rewilding, is so distant from the majority that why should we care? You can shout about rewilding in people's faces all you want, but if we don't have agency over our own surroundings, then why should we care? After all, there's not really much point caring about something you don't have any control over. But that's the way of the world, I guess. We work, we buy food from a supermarket, we pay bills, we catch up on sleep, and then we do it all over again. We don't have much of any agency over most aspects of our lives. And how can rewilding be any different? It can't. Unless we change the system we live under, unless we start performing radical grassroots actions and taking back control over every aspect of our lives. Until we start building resilient and decentralized communities, start to retake agency over our lives, over our needs, over our desires, and over our surroundings. And that, folks, is the strange case of rewilding in Britain. The strangest part of all being that, quite simply, for most people, it just doesn't matter. When the rich and the state and the large endless organizations and corporations have control over every aspect of our lives, including nature and its restoration, why should it matter? When we're shooting towards a 2.5 to 3 degrees temperature increase and a semi-dystopian future, why should it matter? Until we, the people, have agency and control over every aspect of our lives, rewilding just won't matter that much. Only then will rewilding blend in seamlessly with every other aspect of our lives. And only then will we find that maybe we don't actually need rewilding all that much, that all we need is nature, as it moves and breathes around us, through our food, through our communities, and through our lives. Doop. So just a quick end note here. Obviously I do think rewilding is important. The point of that end bit was just to highlight that for most people, rewilding is just so disconnected from like what they actually have control over. And I guess it just frustrates me. I feel like having control over the future where we're heading towards is something that is so out of the grasp of the majority. Especially things that should be something that everyone can have agency over, something as simple as just nature and the restoration of it is something that still in the UK is controlled by those who have money and power. And yeah, I just wanted to highlight that because I just don't really see many people talking about it. Like, it's great that we're bringing back nature and it's great that landowners are doing this, but if you're not one of the 1% who owns half of England, then you don't really have much of a choice in the matter either way, like whether you'd want nature to be restored or not. It's out of your control. And rewilding in combination with everything else going on is just not talked about enough either. Ecologists and environmentalists really focus in on rewilding and isolate nature restoration from like all the other social and economic issues that are happening in the UK. And I think that's also really damaging to the movement because you can't restore nature and not also take into consideration all of the other shit that's happening, like all of the class issues and all of the social issues, like whether abroad or in the UK. So what I'd like to see is more community groups being able to do more to restore nature as they would like to do it, and more communities having more agency over how they'd want the nature around them to look like. And I think that is the most important part of rewilding. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this video and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye bye!